You don't get invited to table 14 because you matter. You get invited because an empty chair looks terrible in the donor photographs. Albert knew he was just a warm body in a cheap, mothball-scented suit. He didn't expect the woman who owned the room to sit beside him. The fluorescent light over the bathroom sink emitted a low, irritating hum. It was the kind of sound that drilled directly into the base of Albert's skull, settling right next to the dull throb of his incoming headache. He leaned closer to the mirror, pulling the skin of his jaw taut, and scraped the disposable razor against the grain. A tiny bead of blood bloomed on his chin. He swore under his breath, pressing a square of toilet paper against the cut. It stung. Everything about tonight was already stinging. "Dad, Mrs. Gable is here." Chloe's voice was small, filtering through the thin plywood door of the bathroom. Albert closed his eyes, inhaling the sharp, artificial pine scent of his bargain brand shaving cream, and let out a long breath. "Come in, Bug," he called back. He wiped the rest of the foam from his face with a damp towel that smelled faintly of mildew, a reminder that he still hadn't fixed the ventilation fan. Walking into the cramped living room of their apartment, the air shifted from damp pine to the heavy, dusty peppermint scent of Mrs. Gable, their elderly neighbor, who charged a merciful $12 an hour. Albert's suit was laid out on the sagging grey sofa. It was charcoal bought 7 years ago for a funeral, and it felt like it. The fabric was heavy, coarse wool that trapped heat and clung to the faint metallic odor of dry cleaning chemicals. As he shrugged into the jacket, the shoulders felt a fraction too tight. He had gained a little weight since his wife died. Not muscle, just the soft, tired weight of a man who ate cold macaroni and cheese over the sink at midnight because he was too exhausted to cook twice. "You look nice, Mr. Hayes," Mrs. Gable said, adjusting her thick cardigan. She didn't look at him when she said it. She was watching a cooking show on the muted television. "Thanks. I won't be late. The event ends at 11, so I should be on the train by 11:30. Chloe tugged at his pant leg. She was 7, missing a front tooth, and her fingers were sticky with something Albert didn't have the time to identify. "Why do you have to go to the boring party?" she asked, wiping her hand on his dark trousers. Albert looked down at the smear of something shiny and pink against the charcoal wool. He didn't sigh. He just took his thumb and rubbed it, trying to blend the glitter into the fabric. "Because Mr. Miller bought a table for the firm, and someone got sick. If the firm's table looks empty, it makes my boss look bad. If my boss looks bad, he gets grumpy. And when he gets grumpy, he looks closely at the accounting department's overtime hours." It was the truth, stripped of any corporate glamour. Chloe didn't care about overtime hours. She just reached up and pressed a puffy, neon green dinosaur sticker onto the face of his wristwatch. "For protection," she declared. Albert stared at the neon stegosaurus, covering the cracked glass of his cheap watch. He didn't peel it off. "Thanks, Bug. Be good for Mrs. Gable." The commute was a 40-minute grind on the subway. The train car smelled of hot brakes, spilled beer, and damp wool. Albert stood holding the metal pole, feeling the rhythmic, jolting sway of the carriage in his knees. Around him, the city shifted. The demographics in the car changed as they traveled further downtown. Tired laborers in heavy boots filtered out, replaced by younger crowds smelling of expensive sandalwood and gin By the time he emerged onto the street at the financial district, the wind coming off the harbor was biting. The Astor Heritage Building loomed ahead, a massive structure of limestone and wrought iron that looked less like a venue and more like a fortress meant to keep people like him out. The transition from the cold, exhaust-choked street to the lobby was an assault on the senses. The air inside was climate-controlled to a perfect, crisp 70 degrees, heavily perfumed with the scent of roasted duck, burning wax, and thousands of stargazer lilies. The floral scent was so thick it coated the back of Albert's throat, tasting bitter and powdery. "Invitation, sir?" The woman at the check-in desk didn't look up immediately. When she did, her eyes performed a rapid, involuntary scan of Albert's poorly fitted collar, the fraying edge of his tie, and the distinct lack of confidence in his posture. "Albert Hayes, guest of Richard Miller, Horizon Architecture." She typed the name into an iPad. A moment of silence stretched. Albert felt the sweat beginning to prickle under his arms. The wool suit was suddenly suffocating. He hated the feeling of being evaluated. He hated the distinct, sinking suspicion that he was about to be turned away and sent back out into the cold. "Ah, yes, table 14, she said, her voice dropping a fraction of a degree in warmth. She handed him a small, heavy piece of cardstock with his name printed in elegant calligraphy. "Through the double doors. Take a left past the ice sculpture." Albert took the card. The edges were gilded. He calculated, quite against his will, that the cost of printing these place cards probably equated to a week's worth of groceries for him and Chloe. "Thank you," he muttered. He walked into the ballroom. The noise was different here. In his world, crowded rooms were loud, filled with shouting and the clatter of dropped things. Here, the wealth acted as an acoustic dampener. The room was packed with hundreds of people, yet the sound was a low, sustained hum of modulated voices, punctuated only by the delicate clink of sterling silver against crystal. The massive chandeliers overhead looked like frozen explosions of glass, casting a harsh, fragmented light over the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. Table 14 was exactly where Albert expected it to be. It was tucked into the far corner of the room, perilously close to the heavy, padded swinging doors leading to the kitchen. Every time a waiter passed through, a warm draft carrying the smell of seared beef and industrial dish soap washed over the table. 2 other people from his firm were already there. Wyatt, a junior analyst who sweat profusely through his shirts and talked too loud, and Sarah, an administrative assistant who looked completely terrified. "Albert, you made it," Wyatt said, already holding a half-empty glass of amber liquid. "Can you believe this place? I heard plates are 2,000 a head. $2,000. I'm going to eat the napkins." Albert pulled out his chair. The wood was heavy, polished mahogany. The seat was upholstered in emerald velvet. "Where's Richard?" he asked, sitting down and immediately adjusting the knot of his tie. "At table 3, with the VIPs, Wyatt scoffed, pointing a cocktail stirrer toward the front of the room near the grand stage. "He just needed us to fill the cheap seats so Horizon doesn't look like a sinking ship." Albert didn't respond. He looked down at his place setting. There were 4 forks. He stared at the outermost one. It was small, curved slightly. He felt a sudden, deep well of exhaustion open up in his chest. He was 36 years old, drowning in medical debt from a wife who had died anyway. raising a daughter on a salary that hadn't kept up with inflation in half a decade. And he was sitting in a room where the floral arrangements cost more than his car. He reached for the water goblet, feeling the slick, icy condensation on the heavy crystal. He drank. The water tasted like cucumber and mint. It made him want to spit it out. He just wanted a regular glass of tap water and for his shoes to stop pinching his toes. The chair to his immediate right was empty. "Who's missing?" Albert asked, nodding toward the vacant seat. Sarah leaned in, looking nervous. "I don't know. The place card just says guest. I think someone from the charity board was supposed to sit here to keep an eye on the lower-tier corporate sponsors. Us." Albert grunted. He picked up his phone, checked the time. 7:45. Only 3 more hours. He rubbed his thumb over the neon-green stegosaurus on his watch face, feeling the raised, rubbery texture of the sticker. The tiny point of friction anchored him. For the next 40 minutes, Albert endured the excruciating ritual of high society small talk from the periphery. Wyatt, a junior analyst sweating heavily through his collar, loudly exchanged hollow Q3 metrics with anyone who would listen. Sarah, an administrative assistant, had retreated entirely, mechanically tearing off small pieces of dinner rolls. The first course arrived. It was a single pan-seared scallop resting on a smear of vibrant purple puree that smelled faintly of earth and truffle. Albert ate it in 2 bites. It was rich, buttery, and entirely unsatisfying. His stomach gave a low, embarrassing rumble. He immediately reached for his water, hoping the ambient hum of the room masked the sound. He was pouring cheap, house-red wine from a carafe into his heavy crystal glass when the atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to shift. It wasn't a sudden silence. The room was too large for a hush to fall. But there was a noticeable ripple, a turning of heads, a subtle repositioning of shoulders. Albert glanced toward the main entrance. She wasn't making a grand entrance, but the space seemed to part for her anyway. Vivienne was tall, wearing a dark navy blue gown that lacked the heavy sequins or tulle of the other women. It was structured, architectural, and looked heavy. She moved with a quick, purposeful stride that telegraphed a deep, vibrating desire to be anywhere else. Flanked by 2 handlers buzzing like anxious moths, she looked nothing like the serene billionaires on television. Even from 30 feet away, Albert could see the rigid tension in her jaw. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe knot, but a few strands clung to the damp skin of her neck. As she walked, she relentlessly picked at the cuticle of her left thumb with her index finger. A sharp, destructive motion. She looked exhausted. Not the physical exhaustion of a double shift, but a deep, hollow, neurological fatigue. The kind that came from never being allowed to turn off. Albert watched as the handler, holding an iPad, pointed toward table 1, bathed in flattering spotlight right beneath the stage. A heavy-set man with white hair waved expansively toward her. Vivienne stopped. She looked at the white-haired man. She looked at the empty chair at table 1. Albert saw her chest rise and fall in a sharp, shallow breath. Then, abruptly, she pivoted on her heel. She left her handlers stranded in the middle of the aisle and began walking toward the back of the room, toward the swinging kitchen doors, toward table 14. The closer she got, the more details Albert caught. The heavy scent of bergamot and cold ozone preceded her, cutting straight through the cloying smell of the lilies. But underneath the expensive perfume, he smelled something else. Coffee. Stale, black coffee. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with a faint redness that makeup couldn't hide. She reached table 14. Wyatt froze, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. Sarah stared at her lap. Vivian looked at the empty chair next to Albert. She didn't look at him, nor at Wyatt. She looked at the chair like it was a life raft. She pulled it out. The heavy mahogany legs scraped loudly against the polished floor, an ugly, grating sound that made neighboring tables wince. She sat down, letting her metallic clutch hit the table with a heavy thud. "Excuse me," Wyatt stammered, his face turning a mottled red. "Ms. Croft, that seat is—" Well, it was empty. Vivienne finally looked up. Her gaze hit Wyatt with the physical force of a closing elevator door. "I am aware it was empty," she said. Her voice was raspy, as if she had spent the entire day talking and had run out of vocal cord. "That is precisely why I am sitting in it. Do you require it for an imaginary friend?" Wyatt swallowed hard, shrinking back. "No, ma'am." Vivienne exhaled a sharp burst of air through her nose. She reached out, pulled the water goblet toward her, and drank half of it in one desperate swallow. Albert sat, motionless. He was acutely aware of the proximity. The sleeve of her heavy navy gown brushed against the coarse, static-filled charcoal wool of his jacket. She set the glass down. Her hand was trembling. Just a fraction. She closed her eyes and pressed the thumb and forefinger of her right hand hard against the bridge of her nose. The silence at table 14 was suffocating, but Albert felt a strange, contrary sense of calm wash over him. A billionaire was sitting next to him, having a quiet breakdown, hiding from her own party. It was so utterly absurd that it stripped away the intimidation factor of the room entirely. Behind them, the heavy kitchen doors swung open. A waiter emerged, carrying a tray of entrees. A blast of hot air, smelling heavily of seared beef and industrial dish soap, washed over the table. Vivian opened her eyes, scowling at the swinging door. "God in heaven," she muttered, barely moving her lips. "It smells like an abattoir back here." Albert picked up his own water glass. He looked straight ahead at the ugly floral centerpiece. "It's the kitchen exhaust," Albert said, his voice flat, conversational. "And the dish pit. Give it 20 minutes and it'll smell exclusively like bleach and wet garbage." Vivienne slowly turned her head. Up close, Albert could see the faint, spidery purple veins beneath the skin under her eyes. She looked at him with a mixture of irritation and genuine confusion. People didn't usually speak to her with that tone. They fawned. They deferred. They didn't offer dry commentary about wet garbage. "And you are?" she asked, not unkindly, but with a sharp edge of authority. "Albert," he said. He didn't offer his firm's name. It didn't matter. "I'm the seat filler." Seat filler. She tested the words. "Like at the Oscars. Less glamorous, more pathetic," Albert corrected, taking a slow sip of the cheap red wine. "My boss bought the table. Someone backed out. The firm couldn't bear the shame of an empty chair, so I was summoned from middle management accounting to chew with my mouth closed and applaud when the rich people pat themselves on the back." Wyatt kicked Albert sharply under the table. Albert didn't flinch. Vivienne stared at the side of his face. She looked at his suit. Her eyes instantly registered the cheap wool, the fraying collar, the bulky tie knot. Then she looked at his hands. They were clean, but the knuckles were rough, and there was a small, angry red nick on his jawline. A tiny, almost imperceptible huff of air escaped her lips. It died before it reached her eyes. "Well, Albert," she said, leaning back slightly, the velvet squeaking under her dress. "At least you know your function." "What's my excuse?" Albert turned to look at her fully. The proximity was jarring. He could see the microscopic weave of her structured gown, the way the harsh chandelier light caught the sharp, exhausted angles of her collarbones. He felt a sudden, sharp sting of self-consciousness about the faint mildew scent of his towel clinging to his jaw, the staleness of his charcoal wool. He pushed it down. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. "You're the bank," Albert said bluntly, breaking the silence. "You're supposed to be at table 1, smiling while they photograph you handing over a novelty check so these people can justify their tax write-offs." Wyatt, sitting across from them, let out a sound that was half gasp, half choke, and suddenly found his phone screen fascinating. Vivian didn't flinch. Her dark eyes locked onto his. There was no outrage, just a sudden, intense focus. The bone-deep fatigue peeled back for a fraction of a second, revealing the razor-sharp intellect that ran Croft Sterling. "You're very cynical for a seat filler," she observed. She reached for a piece of bread from the silver basket, snapping the crust with a sharp crack. "I'm an accountant, Ms. Croft. Cynicism is the job. Numbers don't lie, but the people spending them usually do." "Vivienne," she corrected quietly. She didn't eat the bread. Instead, she picked up a silver butter knife, turning it over and over in her hands. The metal flashed under the lights. A restless, anxious habit. "And what do my numbers say about me, Albert the accountant?" "I don't know your numbers," Albert said. He gestured loosely toward the center of the room. "I just know what it costs to put on this show. The lilies alone. Let's say 100 tables, elaborate arrangements, probably $400 a pop wholesale." $550, Vivienne murmured, still spinning the knife. "They used out-of-season orchids to build volume." Albert nodded, absorbing the data. $55,000, just so the room smells like a funeral parlor instead of a dish pit. He paused, looking down at his plate. The main course had arrived, a small, perfectly circular filet mignon. He stared at the congealing fat. $55,000, he repeated, his voice dropping a register, losing its sharp edge. "That's a year's rent, plus groceries, electricity, a winter coat for my kid, sitting in the middle of a table, dying." The words bypassed his filter. He felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up the back of his neck. He picked up his fork, refusing to look at her, bracing for a lecture on the economic multiplier effect of philanthropy. Instead, the spinning knife stopped. The heavy silver hit the white linen tablecloth with a dull thud. Vivian stared at the floral centerpiece. She looked at the lilies, the orchids, the trailing green vines, for a long, heavy 10 seconds. The ambient roar of the ballroom, clinking crystal, hollow laughter, seemed to mute, leaving only the low, vibrating hum of the overhead vents. "It's obscene," she whispered. Albert stopped chewing. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were unfocused on the petals. "It is entirely, completely obscene. You are right. It's $55,000 of decaying organic matter, funded by an initiative claiming to eliminate urban poverty. She turned her head. The CEO mask was gone. She just looked like a woman standing on the edge of a very steep drop. "I sat in 3 board meetings today," Vivian said, her voice a low, confidential murmur that forced Albert to lean in. "I spent 6 hours arguing with men wearing suits that cost more than your year's rent. We debated a micro-lending program, loans for single mothers to buy sewing machines or fix their cars. The board wanted to raise the interest rate by 0.2% to mitigate risk." She let out a dry, bitter sound. She reached up, rubbing her temples hard enough to pull the skin tight around her eyes. 0.2%. It would generate maybe $80,000 over 5 years. I fought them. I won. I felt like a hero. She dropped her hands to the table, knuckles white. "Then I walked in here and realized I signed off on an event budget where we spent nearly that much on dead flowers." Albert didn't speak. He looked at her hands. The cuticle on her right thumb was bleeding again, a bright bead of red against pale skin, smudged with a faint trace of blue ink. She didn't seem to feel it. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, bypassing the cheap branded pen from his firm. He pulled out a crumpled, unbleached paper napkin he'd shoved there after grabbing coffee from a street cart that morning. He placed it quietly on the table, sliding it toward her. Vivienne stopped talking. She looked at the coarse, wrinkled paper, then at Albert. "Your thumb," he said, gesturing with his chin. "You're bleeding on the rented linen." Vivienne looked down. She stared at the blood as if it belonged to someone else. Slowly, she picked up the cheap napkin. It was rough, a stark contrast to the heavy, hem-stitched linen provided by the caterer. She pressed it tight against her thumb. "Thank you," she murmured. "Don't mention it." Albert cut another piece of lukewarm steak. He ate it mechanically. The silence that followed wasn't suffocating. It was heavy, grounded. The friction of their vastly different realities had sparked, illuminating the absurdity of the room. "You said you have a kid," Vivienne said suddenly, still holding the paper to her thumb. Albert stiffened. Mentioning Chloe here felt like a violation. This room was transactional, built on leverage. Chloe was sticky fingers and missing teeth. "A daughter," Albert said, his voice tightening. "She's 7. Vivienne's eyes dropped from his face to his left hand, resting on the table, specifically to his wrist. Albert's frayed jacket sleeve had ridden up. Sitting loudly on the cracked glass face of his cheap watch, glowing faintly under the harsh chandelier, was the puffy, neon-green Stegosaurus sticker. A sharp jolt of panic hit him. He quickly yanked his arm back, tugging the rough wool down over his wrist in a clumsy, defensive motion. It was the desperate reflex of a man trying to hide his frayed edges from a woman who dealt in billions. "Don't," Vivienne said softly. Albert froze. She wasn't smiling, but the cynical edge in her eyes had melted into genuine curiosity. She reached out, her fingers hovering an inch over his wrist. She didn't touch him, but the proximity of her hand, smelling of cold ozone and bergamot, made the hair on his arm stand up. "Is that a Stegosaurus?" she asked. Albert swallowed hard. His armor felt paper-thin. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "It's for protection." Vivienne pulled her hand back. She looked at the neon sticker, then up at his face, mapping the exhaustion around his mouth, the shadows under his eyes, the tiny shaving nick on his chin. She didn't see a seat filler in a cheap suit. She saw a man holding up a paper shield given to him by a child. "Does it work?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Albert looked at the empty chair where she had sought refuge. He looked at the bleeding thumb she was pressing a street cart napkin against. "I don't know," Albert said honestly, the fight draining completely out of him. "I'm still here, aren't I?" Vivienne stared at him for a long, unbroken moment. The deafening symphony of wealth roared around them, but at table 14, tucked by the kitchen doors smelling of roasted meat and bleach, a profound, shifting quiet had finally settled. "Yes," Vivienne said quietly, turning her gaze back to her own plate. "You're still here." Dessert arrived right as the speeches began. It was a hollow sphere of spun sugar resting on a mirror-glazed, dark chocolate tart. It looked like glass. It shattered just as easily when Albert drove the side of his spoon through it. On the main stage, the white-haired man Vivienne had avoided earlier was currently leaning into the microphone, his voice booming over the PA system. He was talking about synergy. He was talking about community elevation. He was talking for a very long time without actually saying anything. At table 14, Vivienne was staring at her shattered sugar sphere. She hadn't picked up her spoon. The cheap paper napkin from the coffee shop was now a crumpled, pale ball resting next to her heavy crystal water goblet. "They always serve these ridiculous desserts," she said quietly, her voice barely cutting through the thunderous, obligatory applause echoing around them. "Things that look like architecture, things that break the moment you try to consume them." Albert ate a piece of the chocolate. It was overwhelmingly rich, coating his teeth and the roof of his mouth. "It keeps people busy," he replied. "Hard to ask difficult questions when your mouth is glued shut with ganache." Vivienne turned her head, offering a small, dry smile. It didn't reach her eyes, but it loosened the tight corners of her mouth. Before she could respond, the heavy atmosphere behind them shifted. A man in a sharply tailored tuxedo stepped out from the shadows near the kitchen doors. He had an earpiece tucked discreetly into his right ear and the exasperated, tense posture of a bomb disposal expert. "Ms. Croft," the man said. His voice was clipped, professional, but laced with a heavy undercurrent of panic. "We've been looking everywhere. Mr. Henderson is wrapping up his speech. They need you at the stairs in 2 minutes for the check presentation and the press photos." Vivienne closed her eyes. The mask, the one that had slipped just a fraction, snapped back into place so fast, Albert almost heard it click. The exhaustion remained, but the vulnerability vanished, buried instantly under layers of corporate armor. "I'm coming, David," she said flatly. She stood up. The velvet of the chair groaned. She picked up her small metallic clutch. She didn't look at Wyatt or Sarah, who were both sitting rigidly, pretending not to listen. She looked down at Albert. For a second, the vast, unbridgeable chasm of their realities yawned open between them. She was going to walk up to a brightly lit stage and hand over a piece of cardboard representing millions of dollars. He was going to walk out into the freezing wind, take a 40-minute subway ride, and figure out how to stretch $20 of groceries until Tuesday. "Albert," she said. He didn't stand up. He felt if he stood up, his cheap wool suit would betray him entirely under her gaze. He just looked up at her, his jaw tight. "Ms. Croft." "Vivienne," she corrected again, her tone sharper this time. She reached down to the table. She didn't take the bloody paper napkin. Instead, her fingers brushed against the heavy, gilded cardstock resting above Albert's forks. She picked up his place card. Albert Hayes, Horizon Architecture. She stared at the calligraphy for a second, her face unreadable, then slipped the thick card into her metallic clutch. It closed with a sharp or decisive snap. "Have a safe trip back to the real world," she said. She turned and walked away, David hovering half a step behind her. Albert watched her navy blue gown disappear into the sea of black tuxedos and glittering dresses. The heavy scent of bergamot and ozone faded almost instantly, swallowed up by the sudden draft of hot bleach and dishwater as a waiter pushed through the kitchen doors. Albert looked at the empty velvet chair. Then he looked at his watch. 9:45. He rubbed the neon green Stegosaurus sticker with his thumb. It was time to go. The cold outside was a physical shock. It hit Albert in the chest, stealing his breath as he pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the Astor Heritage Building. The wind whipping off the harbor felt like it was slicing right through the thin, fraying lining of his coat. He walked fast, his head down, shoving his bare hands deep into his pockets. The subway station was a cavern of dirty white tiles and the overwhelming stench of stale urine and hot metal. He swiped his card, moving mechanically. He was exhausted. Not the physical tiredness of a long day, but a deep, marrow-sucking fatigue. The encounter with Vivienne felt like a hallucination. Sitting on the hard orange plastic seat of the train carriage, rocking violently as it screamed through the dark tunnels, Albert felt entirely hollowed out. He had sat next to a billionaire, bled his cynicism onto the table, and for a fleeting second felt like a human being instead of a spreadsheet entry. But the carriage was empty, the lights overhead flickered, and his bank account was still overdrawn. He let himself into his apartment just after 11. The air inside smelled of dust and Mrs. Gable's peppermint lotion. The old woman was asleep in the armchair, the television projecting a blue, silent glow across her face. Albert tapped her shoulder gently. She woke with a start, gathered her things, and took the $20 bill Albert handed her. A tip he couldn't afford, but gave anyway, because it was late. After she left, Albert walked into Chloe's room. It was little more than a converted closet, just big enough for a twin bed and a plastic dresser. She was sprawled across the mattress, the blankets kicked off, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whistle in the quiet dark. Albert stood in the doorway for a long time. He felt the coarse wool of his suit jacket dragging on his shoulders. He smelled the lingering phantom scent of roasted meat and expensive lilies clinging to the fabric. He reached down and gently pulled the blanket over Chloe's small shoulders. She mumbled something in her sleep, her sticky hand curling into a fist. He went to the bathroom, stripped off the charcoal suit, and threw it into the hamper. He didn't want to look at it ever again. Friday morning was grey and unforgiving. The sky over the city looked like a bruised slab of iron, promising rain but refusing to deliver it. Albert sat at his desk in the bullpen of Horizon Architecture. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that same low, irritating hum that mirrored the ache behind his eyes. His coffee, poured from the break-room carafe, tasted like burnt copper. "I heard she didn't even stay for the speeches," Richard Miller said, leaning against the edge of Albert's cubicle partition. Richard wore a custom-tailored suit that fit perfectly. He smelled of expensive aftershave and unearned confidence. Croft, I mean. Wyatt said she sat at your table for 20 minutes, scowled at everyone, and bolted. Albert didn't look up from his dual monitors. The spreadsheet in front of him was a mess of red columns. She stayed long enough to eat, Albert said, his voice completely devoid of inflection. Richard chuckled, a wet, condescending sound. Well, good on you for holding the fort, Hayes. Makes the firm look engaged. Get those Q3 projections to me by lunch, yeah? Richard tapped his knuckles against the particle board partition and walked away. Albert squeezed his eyes shut for a second, rubbing his temples. He hated this place. He hated the beige walls, the smell of microwaved fish, the endless grinding wheel of numbers that meant nothing to him but dictated whether he could afford to fix the heater in his apartment. At 11:15 a.m., his desk phone rang. It wasn't the internal line. It was an outside number, displaying a localized downtown area code. Albert picked up the receiver, wedging it between his ear and his shoulder as he kept typing. Albert Hayes, Horizon Accounting. You were wrong about the flowers, Albert. Albert stopped typing. His fingers froze over the keyboard. The voice on the other end of the line was slightly raspy, low, and entirely devoid of corporate warmth. Ms. Croft, Albert breathed, the air suddenly catching in his throat. Vivian, she corrected, the irritation bleeding through the speaker. And you were wrong. I had my team pull the invoice this morning. They didn't spend $55,000 on the floral arrangements. A pause, heavy and sharp. They spent $72,000. They imported white hydrangeas from Colombia. Albert stared at the flashing cursor on his spreadsheet. He didn't know what to say. He looked around the bullpen. Wyatt was 2 desks over, vigorously clicking his mouse. Nobody was paying attention. The real world was still moving, oblivious to the fact that a billionaire was on line 4. I'm sorry to hear that, Albert finally managed, his voice dropping low, defensive instinct kicking in. Did you call my firm just to correct my math? No, Vivienne said. The sound of rustling paper came through the line. I called because I spent the last 3 hours firing the event management company, entirely restructuring the charity's oversight board, and violently arguing with my CFO about the micro-lending initiative. Albert's brow furrowed. Congratulations. Don't be insolent, Albert. I'm exhausted. She sighed, a long, ragged sound that sounded incredibly human over the digital connection. I am surrounded by people who nod when I speak. I am surrounded by people who look at a $72,000 invoice for dead hydrangeas and see a tax deduction. I need someone who looks at that number and sees a year's rent. I need someone who sees the absurdity of it. Albert gripped the phone tighter. His knuckles turned white. He looked down at his left wrist. He was wearing a faded grey sweater today, the sleeves pushed up. The cheap watch was there. The neon green Stegosaurus was still clinging to the cracked glass. What are you saying? Albert asked carefully, refusing to let hope into his chest. Hope was dangerous. Hope was a spun sugar dessert that shattered when you touched it. I am pulling the micro-lending initiative out from under the main foundation's umbrella, Vivienne said, her voice dropping into a rapid, clinical cadence. I'm setting it up as an independent operational arm. Real loans for real people. No 0.2% risk mitigation nonsense. But I need an internal auditor to run the books. Someone who isn't trying to climb a corporate ladder, but just wants the math to actually mean something. She paused. Albert could hear the faint sound of city traffic in the background on her end. "I have your place card, Albert Hayes," she said quietly. "I know where you work. I know what an intermediate accountant at a mid-tier architectural firm makes. I will double it, full benefits, and you don't have to wear a suit unless you want to." Albert couldn't breathe. The air in the beige cubicle felt too thin. He looked at the red columns on his monitor. He looked at the peeling laminate on his desk. He thought of Chloe, sleeping in a closet, eating generic cereal. He thought of the heavy, cold dread that sat in his stomach every single time he opened the mail. "Why?" Albert choked out. The cynical armor was completely gone. He was stripped bare, sitting in the middle of a crowded office, his voice trembling. "Because I gave you a napkin. Because you didn't look away," Vivienne said softly. "Everyone else in that room looked at me and saw a bank. You looked at me and saw someone bleeding on a rented tablecloth. You saw the rot underneath the glitter, Albert. I need that." A heavy silence stretched over the line. "So," Vivienne said, her voice regaining a fraction of its sharp, demanding edge. "Are you going to sit there crunching numbers for men who buy tables just to fill seats? Or are you going to come work for me and actually do something?" Albert looked down at the neon green dinosaur on his watch. He touched the raised, rubbery surface. For protection. He didn't smile, but he felt a sudden, fierce heat rise in his chest, a grounding, solid anchor in a world that had felt adrift for years. "Where is your office?" Albert asked. "Send me your resignation," Vivienne replied. "I'll send a car." Albert hung up the phone. He didn't cheer. He didn't jump out of his chair. He simply closed the spreadsheet of Q3 projections without saving it, pulled a blank piece of paper from his printer, and began to write. Sometimes the most profound connections don't happen in the spotlight. They happen in the shadows of the room, born from shared exhaustion and undeniable reality. Albert and Vivienne's story proves that being truly seen is worth more than any gilded invitation. If this story struck a chord with you, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs a reminder that authenticity matters, and subscribe to the channel for more grounded, deeply human stories. Thank you for listening.